more than more than anything else, I would just say thank you for all of your work on housing in our communities. You know, as I was saying as I came in, it doesn't really matter where you travel in our state. You know, Eastern Plains, the Front Range, the Western Slope. Affordable housing is a real challenge for communities, and I think we hear that time and time again. And then finding solutions or policy opportunities that really work for our diverse state is also a challenge because there are so many different needs in so many different communities. But one thing that I continue to hear from across the state is simply the need to be able to continue living or to be able to afford to live in the community of your choosing in our state. And I think, you know, that really dovetails with my commitments to making sure that our state is an affordable and really a welcoming place for everyone. And so, you know, housing was obviously a big topic of conversation and a huge policy priority in our caucus. Last legislative session, a number of bills were passed. I'm happy to kind of talk through some of those things. And I would say that you even saw those housing conversations play out in the special session, which we completed a few weeks back, in relation to affordability and property taxes and some of the concerns that folks have in that space. So it's been a consistent effort, I think, at the state legislature to address this. And as you all know, and I think folks who work in this space would readily admit to, there is no one policy solution which will solve the affordable housing crisis for our state. It's going to take a lot of creative ideas, a lot of collaborative work across jurisdictions, and quite frankly, intentional efforts and investment of resources in order to really ensure that we have communities that are affordable and accessible for folks to live in. I will say that from my end, I really focused a lot on mobile home park communities. That's been a huge point of policy consideration for my office, and quite frankly, a point of pride to work alongside mobile home park residents in our state. Over the recent years, we've created a more meaningful opportunity to purchase for mobile home park residents. We've aligned federal drinking water standards with expectations in mobile home parks. And in the last legislative session, we really went after predatory rent-to-own and lease-to-own agreements and made a number of updates to the Mobile Home Park Act as well. And that work continues to be important because when we're talking about mobile home park residents, we're largely talking about a disproportionate number of older adults. We're talking about a disproportionate number of veterans. We're talking about a disproportionate number of folks with disabilities, folks whose documentation maybe isn't the same as mine. And it is the state's largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing. And I think we need to continue to work at the state level to make sure it stays that way, meaning mobile home parks are typically affordable for residents without any subsidy from the state. And that is a really important consideration in terms of how we think about housing policy in the state. I'll highlight, if it's all right, Trish, I'll highlight a couple of bills. And my apologies, my text messages are also coming in at the same time. I'm a Detroit Tigers fan, so people are rightly congratulating me on our team's success this year, a decade in the making. But I will say that a number of these bills were not my bills in particular, but I was pleased to support them. Maybe what we can do is even just work through some of the bills that have passed and pause for questions. And then I can also then after that give an update of the legislation I'm going to be bringing in the next session. But happy to defer to you all on if that structure works. I see some nods and thumbs up, so I'm going to say yes. Okay. So I think some of the bigger bills that passed last session, I'll just touch on them briefly. 1313 was housing and transit oriented communities. This is a really important piece of legislation when we think about the nexus not only of climate goals and affordable housing in our communities, but also the ability to build density where it makes sense in terms of existing resources and infrastructure. And so all sorts of parameters inside of that bill in terms of density that can be built, obligations for a local government to engage in a process to sort of define those areas and then really work to build what I would understand to be gentle density inside of areas that have a nexus with transit. As someone who moved here from Metro Atlanta and regularly had to drive to the MARTA station and then sat in an empty parking lot and picked up my spouse after work, the ability to build housing right next to transit or in close proximity to transit is really key to make sure that we both eliminate vehicle miles traveled, but also make sure that we have housing for folks with access to public transit, especially low income and deeper affordable housing units. So I think that's a really important piece of legislation. 1152 was accessory dwelling units. This made by 2025, I believe, ADUs, something that a homeowner can build by right in the state of Colorado, and then a number of considerations around where those can be placed on a property, making sure that there's not arbitrary or restrictive zoning standards, which would prevent a property owner from doing that. It's really focused on the front range, the MPOs in the state, meaning we're building density where we think it will have the most impact short term, understanding that, of course, our mountain communities and Eastern Plain folks have considerations there as well. But when we look at how to move the needle on some of these things, ADUs inside of those metropolitan areas really does make a lot of sense. Minimum parking requirements was another bill that passed this past legislative session. When you look at the cost of affordable housing and you look at the cost of building parking that accompanies that affordable housing, it's incredible the capital stack that is devoted to simply paving parking lots and striping those lots. In many cases where the residents may not actually use those parking spaces. I would say that overall, we are overparked in the state of Colorado to the detriment of our ability to build affordable housing. And so taking a look at that and abolishing mandatory parking requirements, minimum parking requirements, is a really huge piece towards making sure we're using land for housing people. And of course, providing parking where it makes sense, but not having this arbitrary standard in place where you're just looking at a sea of empty parking lots as opposed to places where folks could potentially live. In terms of other bills, there was a residential occupancy limits bill that passed on the renter side of things. For-cause eviction was another huge piece of policy that passed in terms of renters' rights. And then I think one thing that I'm really excited about is the warranty of habitability law we passed. We heard from several communities in Denver. Most of them operated and owned by Tryon, which is a property management company that spans multiple states, where we had older adults that were stuck on the second or third floor of their apartment building for days on end because the apartment elevators were out of order. And these are folks with mobility issues and other concerns. And I just think at the end of the day, we have to make sure that our housing is safe for folks. And that's a key, I think, value of my caucus as well. I'll close with one bill because I feel like I've talked a lot and I'd much rather have a conversation about some of these policies. I passed House Bill 1175, which was a right of first refusal for local governments. This came back from last year when the Governor Polis vetoed House Bill 1190. 1190 was a much more broad policy proposal that would have applied a right of first refusal for a local government to basically purchase a lot of the multifamily housing inside of their jurisdictions. 1175 took a more right-sized approach to that, to say that if a property is currently affordable housing, meaning there's an affordability covenant in place, it was made affordable through tax credits or something of the like, not simply because your landlord accepted a voucher in order to pay for that housing. But if that property is currently affordable housing and it comes to market, a local government, meaning a city or a county or CHAPA, would have a right of first refusal on that property, provided that they commit to keeping it long-term affordable housing for 40 or more years. And so that is a really important piece of the puzzle here as we think about not just how to build more affordable housing, but how not to lose it on the back end, right? It is incredibly difficult to build affordable housing to begin with, and preserving it is a value of our community as well. And so I will stop there. I absolutely love talking housing and bouncing ideas off folks. So if there's other bills that I didn't mention, happy to sort of tackle those and tell you what I don't know. But I will say that I think housing is going to be back in a big way next session, and rightly so.
All right, so does anyone have any questions about the bills Representative Boesenecker has reviewed, or anything else related to this, to those bills? The transit-oriented communities with the density that's coming in, are you seeing, and everything I read is a lot of opposition to density, whenever that word comes up, density. So what are you seeing happen? Are you seeing movement towards cities designated? Do they have to designate those areas before there's building goes on there? And then how's the opposition going to be handled there?
Yeah, it's a hard conversation, right? And I think unfortunately, I would say that the city of Fort Collins stands as a great example here. We passed 2 iterations of a land use code update that largely mirrored what Senate Bill 213 would have done 2 years ago. TOD, transit-oriented development or transit-oriented communities, ADUs, upzoning, the ability to build more than simply a one single-family home on a lot, and twice those were repealed through citizen initiative. And fair and fine, right? I mean, I don't fault folks for making their voice heard. They have a right to do that. But our petition threshold in the city of Fort Collins and in most jurisdictions is so low. Oftentimes, what you have happen is a large, very vocal, or a small group of folks who are very vocal can really direct the conversation at the local level. I have understood it as an obligation and, quite frankly, a responsibility of the state to understand affordable housing as not simply a local control and a local concern. What we do locally impacts jurisdictions that surround us. We saw this with basically no growth policies that different jurisdictions have enacted over the years. And what all that happens, quite frankly, is you drive up the house price of housing in surrounding communities, because now you have a very limited asset that folks know what they can get the price, what price they can drive for that. And so I think it becomes quite frankly, a conversation sometimes of, local governments aren't doing enough is sort of the narrative. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think our local governments understand in large part the need for affordable housing in their communities. But in the instance of cities like Fort Collins, we're stuck. We're stuck. And this is where I think the state has an obligation to step in and say, we need to look at this not just on the jurisdiction by jurisdiction level, but we need to look at it regionally and we need to look at it at a statewide level. And so it does mean obligations for our local governments. And I think Rep. Woodrow and Rep. Judah were really thoughtful about how they structured the requirements of that. And yes, they'll have to identify areas. It requires local governments to zone for at least 40 units per acre, within a quarter mile of bus stops and rail stations. And so I think at the end of the day, it is going to mean density, but quite frankly, it's going to mean density where we want it. Because the most unfortunate thing that I think could happen would be that we start to build density in places that aren't served by infrastructure, that are going to mean more vehicle miles traveled, that are more expensive to develop. So how do you land at affordable housing when you already have to pay for infrastructure that's not there? It's really difficult. And so I would much rather have a conversation about ways to do gentle density inside of areas that are already served by transit, where the infrastructure is already there, as opposed to sprawl, which at the end of the day, I think is a very difficult thing in terms of how we get folks from point A to point B and how we meet our climate goals. And it's a tough conversation to have, but I think we have to incentivize it at every step we can. And at the same time, recognize where the state has a role to really say, these things actually need to happen because it's for the betterment of our entire community.
Great, thank you. Kathy, I see your hand up.
Thanks. Thanks for all your great work.
Well, thank you, Kathy. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. So wanted to talk about the right of first refusal and the noticing. Wanted to find out how it's going, and it's always hard when there's a fairly complicated bill that passes to get everything to work out, especially noticing. But I do have a concern and an ask or a question, I guess, with the noticing. For local advocacy, it would be very helpful to know what properties are coming up for an opportunity to be part of the right of first refusal. But there's no way if your local government doesn't tell you, I guess. The county or the city clerk, I guess, is the notifying official. There's no real way of finding out from an advocacy point of view. And I was wondering if there's a way to make that happen, and just kind of an overall, how's it going with that anyway?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. We are one of the first states to adopt this on a statewide level. And I will say, first and foremost, the policy is not as robust as I would have hoped for it to be. And at the same time, I think it's really important in Colorado that we provide the ability of other states to build on our efforts. And so more on this, and I think more we can do here. Kathy, to your questions about noticing, and then how do you sort of build a database, as it were, of what properties are sort of subject to a right of first refusal inside of your jurisdiction. We do have inside of the bill two separate points at which the owner of an affordable housing, multifamily housing unit would have to notify CHAPA of their intent. And that happens, I believe, at the 3-year mark and then at the 1-year mark before those affordability covenants expire. At the 3-year mark, the requirements are less robust because they might change their plans on what to do. But at the 1-year mark, we feel like a owner of an affordable housing unit would be able to say with a certain amount of clarity whether they intend to recapitalize, whether they're going to bring that property to market, whether they're just going to let it roll over into market rate housing. We feel like that's something at the 1-year mark that we'll have a pretty good idea of. That is upcoming work. CHAFA does have a database, and some of our friends in this space, Enterprise Community Partners, also has access to that database. I think Colorado Coalition for the Homeless does as well. So I can connect you with some resources of folks who may be able to help you pinpoint some properties. Between those two things, I'm hopeful that with CHAFA's efforts and then also our ability to really work towards making that information more available to folks who have, I think, altruistic intentions in this space. We don't want to put it out there for everybody because at the end of the day, different interests will have approached those properties with different proposals. But I think that could be one way to get at it. In terms of the noticing thing, it's going to be a work in progress a little bit. I do have some documentation that we're just awaiting for feedback from CHAFA on, which is sort of a flow chart of a if-then in terms of the right of first refusal process. Happy to share that with this group. I might just need you to send me an email to remind you, but we can get you that document so that hopefully on the local level, it sort of demystifies some of the process. At the end of the day, it can be very simple for a property owner to simply make sure they're sending the right notices to the clerk. But we also need our clerks to know what to do with that next. And that's a little bit of the education that's still ongoing. And I think it's a really valuable conversation to have. I hope that answers your question.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So please ping me. And if I don't have the guidance yet, I will get it to you as soon as I do, but I'm happy to share that resource as soon as we've just vetted it a little more thoroughly.
Great. Thank you. Mindy.
Yes, thank you. It's good to see you, Representative.
Nice to see you as well.
I do have a question about the ADU bill, and I've been out of the loop on that for a while, but the final bill, does it also apply to properties within HOAs that already had covenants prohibiting ADUs, or is only for new HOAs that are formed beyond the date of the bill's effective date?
No, my understanding, and I'll double check that, and if I'm wrong, happy to follow up, but my understanding is it applies to existing ADUs as well as newly contemplated existing HOAs, as well as future HOAs. Yeah.
It's great, because I wasn't sure if the state was able to supersede the...
We are, and we did it on things like xeriscaping in the past. So that's probably a less popular example, but I think it does stand as a good example of where the state can step in and say, no, this is actually the baseline for what happens in these communities.
Thank you.
And yeah, there's all sorts of parameters in place about where it doesn't make sense. I would just say this, like I'm currently building an accessory building with habitable space in my backyard. It'll be about a $250,000 project at the end of the day. I think sometimes the sort of doomsday scenario that folks present around ADUs, that there's going to be one in every backyard, it just doesn't pencil out. And especially until you can open up the financing for someone to build that without the homeowner having to take on either a loan or a home equity line of credit, which at interest rates today are really difficult propositions. So I think it's a great bill, very supportive of the bill. Is it going to solve our affordable housing crisis? No. Yeah.
Great. Okay, Julie.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Andy. Julie Stackhouse.
Hey,
How are you?
Good.
So I now chair Fort Collins Planning and Zoning. So I'm right along with you in terms of the challenges that have been experienced up here over the past few years with trying to create a more favorable condition for housing. One thought to pass along and then one question, because I hear it from the developers pretty frequently. And the thought is, in terms of the transit-oriented development, in Fort Collins, there's really not anything left along those heavy transit lines, so it'll probably be redevelopment. So I just put that out there because I still think it's absolutely the right thing to do, but I also don't see it being a sort of silver bullet, just like ADUs. This is going to take some time to make this all work. So good work, but also I think we're going to need a lot of patience. the second thing has to do with the defects law. I don't know if you're going to get into this, but we do have a couple of developers. I think there's 5 actually in Colorado that will still do condos, but they are specialized. Their some insurance companies will not insure developers who haven't been in that business. And what I'm hearing is you don't have to throw out the defects law itself, but just allow developers to do remediation before you get into litigation, so that there's an opportunity to correct. And they believe that would bring more developers back into the condo space. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so there was 2 construction defects bills last session, and they each started in opposite chambers. And it's this like unfortunate situation where you basically have policy being fired over the bow of the opposing team. And that's what those bills basically were, in my opinion. I think I'll say the challenges are this. The conversation needs to be moved from the place of simply pitting homeowners' rights versus builder and developer rights into a place of, if we take whatever action it is that actually lends a measure of confidence to the market, and insurers will come back to the state and offer a product that allows for condos to be built. I think we aren't there yet in terms of maybe a policy solution that fits that mold. I read the Common Sense Institute report on this. Peter Lafari is a good friend, runs Maker Housing Authority in Adams County, really, really bright individual. He rightly noted in that report that there isn't another state that can serve as a blueprint for Colorado in solving this, that we really need to chart our own course. I think that's spot on. The challenge is getting insurance to come to the table and say, if we pull this lever, we will be open for business in the state of Colorado again. And we have not had that measure of confidence from them. And I think we have to hold their feet to the fire, quite frankly, to understand that they're going to be able to offer us a book of business, which will allow for this product to be brought to market. I think there's still a runway even after you find that solution, where you're going to have to work with developers to be able to help them understand that the baggage they have around this for so long is now something that they don't have to worry about ending up in litigation immediately about an issue. Because, Julie, I agree with you. Like, we should have a process that offers meaningful remediation for an issue, that doesn't simply allow things to go to litigation. I also do believe, however, that a homeowner has a right to private action, a private right of action. I mean, I think that is something that we can't then simply take off the table, but you got to provide a runway and a process that is meaningful to solve those things, because at the end of the day, I don't think anybody personally wants to end up in court about, a cracked foundation or, whatever it might be. I think folks do want to solve those things in a way that keeps them in their home. The challenge will simply be getting insurance to actually play ball and offer a product that makes this a viable option, because we need more of this product. And I'll say this, we need more product that is smaller footprint, lower cost, as first-time homes for folks, but not just simply first-time homes, also homes where folks can choose to downsize into if they want. That flexibility on our housing spectrum does not exist at present. My first home was a 1948 700 square foot home in Metro Atlanta. You will not find a builder that can build that home to scale today, because it simply doesn't pencil out. So I think the ability to build that product or a condo is a really important thing. I think we just have to hold insurance to their feet to the fire a little bit to say, okay, if we take these steps, let's back off of the whole conversation around we're stripping this group of their rights, or this is going to end up in litigation. Let's talk about what we can build if we pull this lever.
Yeah, and I haven't studied Texas
This is
law.
fascinating. Nice puff, by the way. Yeah, just a little fresh de-egging air, if that's okay. It's 68 degrees, apparently.
Trish, if I could just throw in a comment, at one of the recent forums I was at.
Whichever.
So
Do both.
Trish,
Ask the JPad to please mute.
Oh,
yeah, JPad mute, please. Can I mute them?
I think you can.
There we go.
I was at a recent forum on affordable housing in Fort Collins, and the Texas law was brought up. Is that anything that would have possibilities for Colorado in terms of still preserving homeowner rights, but perhaps avoiding some of the costs of early litigation?
Yeah, I would have to look at it further. I think it was referenced in that report I mentioned as well. Listen, I am all ears on this stuff because at the end of the day, we know there's a problem here. We know condo production is non-existent. I mean, you even talk to groups that are, I think on the very liberal side of housing policy, and they recognize there's an issue here, right? So I think we have to get it a solution. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I fully anticipate we'll see a bill this next.
Well, and I know I'm pushing you on this, but there's
No,
a
no,
lot
it's great.
I don't think we are going to solve without more dollars, just simply more dollars,
Definitely.
because housing is expensive, and even with Prop 123, it's not enough money. But I am seeing developments that are going to townhomes instead of condos because of the inability to get insurance, and the condos will cost more. And that's the stuff that makes me just a little frustrated, is to say there could have been an alternative that maybe would have been more affordable for a few more people.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and it opens up all sorts of opportunities then for condo conversions. I mean, but we just have to bring that product to market and be able to build it at scale.
So the message is keep working on it, Representative.
Yeah. No,
All right.
it's a really important conversation. And Julie, I really appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, great. All right, so I don't see any other hands up. So let's move on to what we might see coming down the road in 2025.
Okay. Well, I can speculate on my own bills because I'm fairly close to them, and noting that it's probably a drop in the bucket of what you're going to see housing wise. But I'm happy to talk through a couple of the proposals that I'll be bringing. I'll touch on the one that's least fully formed at present, but I think conversations are just starting around it, and that is to bring back some form of single stair development, single stair multifamily housing in the state. What that looks like at present, we're not sure. And it involves a lot of conversations with our fire folks, with our building code folks. But what we're talking about here is a product that is, 4 or 5 stories in height, served by a single staircase, but still elevators, obviously, for ADA and accessibility issues. You see this product built all across Europe. You'll see it in the Pacific Northwest. And oftentimes the benefits of properties like this are not simply the aesthetic, which they, I think, look very different than a traditional, 20-story apartment building, but they're also, quite frankly, more environmentally friendly. If you think of that traditional apartment building, on each floor, you have that central corridor going to each unit on each side. That is wasted space in terms of heating and cooling in each unit. You end up with smaller units. It's really hard to find an apartment that you can house an entire family in. Typically in single stair developments, you're able to build larger apartments on a smaller footprint. Oftentimes, 3, 4 bedroom apartments that span both sides of a development. They're within a very minimal distance to that stairway. And we find that with advances in building technology and fire code as it is, there's really no data to show that they are any less safe than existing dual staircase development. What can often happen inside of a small footprint is that second staircase would preclude a developer from building multifamily on a lot because it takes up a lot of space. And quite frankly, those stairways are huge cost drivers in developments as well. And so we'd like to think through if there's a way to right size that policy, probably not in unincorporated parts of our state, but in jurisdictions that are more urban, to see if there's a way to put forward a policy that would lean in on that single stair conversation. I think right now the challenge for a developer is every single one of those proposals requires a variance from existing land code. And if you can imagine as a developer, that's just simply a risk that most folks aren't willing to take. So this could be a way to build more gentle density inside of jurisdictions. There's a lot of work to do to make sure that fire professionals are comfortable, that our building friends are comfortable here. But I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. We've seen other jurisdictions take action, Pacific Northwest, Portland, Seattle, I believe. And then in Europe as well, most of these are built with steel or block. To really mitigate some of the fire challenges that you might have. So I'll stop there, or I can keep going.
Just a quick comment. We did a little bit of hopeful advocacy around that, but didn't bring it home in the league. And a lot of the opposition was just impressions. Yeah. You could present all the data you want, and it didn't meet with impressions. So if there can be some outrolling of information to kind of change the initial reaction, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, no, it's feedback well taken, and there's just a lot of I don't want to say baggage, but I think a lot of misconception around a second stairway makes my building safer. And in a 20-story development, I would say that that's probably true. You know, what we heard from some of our fire chiefs were, well, what if someone sets a fire in one of the staircases? And my response to that is, well, what if they set it in both? I mean, you know, if you have someone who has ill intent, I mean, I'm pretty sure they're not shooting for 50% in terms of how to, you know, damage a property. They're probably going to go for the whole thing, you know. So I think the ability to really lean into some of those conversations and dispel some of the misconceptions we have around the safety that a second staircase does or doesn't provide is really helpful. We're early in the conversation and need to do, I think, a better job than last session in terms of engaging stakeholders on that bill.
Kathy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Kathy Smith just said. I was a member of our committee in the league that listened to those arguments, and personally, I was one of the people that was not persuaded that it was a good idea. So I think some of the things are missing are the data, you know, the case studies, all the stories about, you know, why this is a reasonable deal, why it's safe. And also, I think it would be very helpful to have some floor plans, you know, show us the design. I think that would be really helpful to show how beneficial it is to get, you know, fit more in that space. And so I think a little more detail, a little more data, well, maybe a lot more data to persuade people like me that it is a safe scenario. That would be
no, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, and I think that information is out there. And certainly, as we start to pull together conversations with fire and our building friends, that'll be forthcoming. I will say that our governor is gung ho on this idea, which is really interesting, and we're really working closely with the governor's team on how to pull together stakeholders in a way that maybe gets them to move a little more than they did last session. And I think that's going to be an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
There are a couple of good, really detailed reports out there with data, but the problem is that if you gave somebody a 40-page report without digesting it, then, you know, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. So I think making the data digestible is maybe the secret.
Right. Yeah, to be distilled into, you know, convenient bits and stories, you know, that are easily read and understood by people, so you can really get the context, the whole scenario in a nutshell. And also, I think it would be nice to hear positive perspectives from the firefighting side of society, you know, to get, I think once they're convinced, people would be convinced, you know. So, but I do think I do think seeing actual plans might be, you know, not detailed, but just rough outlines of, you know, what it looks like, that would help people understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think so many times folks go to sort of like, okay, it's going to look like an existing apartment building, but they're just going to be one stairway, right? Well, that would be immensely irresponsible to put, you know, like to build something like that. Or there was a hotel fire in the 1940s in Atlanta that was an incredibly deadly tragedy. I think it was 20 plus stories and it was stick built, right? So, I mean, I think, you know, when you look at some of sort of where our anxieties around only having a single staircase come from, it's very important to sort of link that to how we built buildings historically versus how we build them now. And I think, Kathy, to your point, nobody's going to read a 40-page report. You know, I think to be able to distill that down into a couple examples that are really helpful for folks is important, so that we can have the debate we should be having, which is this something that makes sense for our state or not? But let's root it in practice and good data.
Great. Okay, so Representative, could you talk a little bit about the modular housing front?
Yeah, in fact, I just got a text from the governor's team that I should have some outlines tomorrow on some of the proposals we're looking at. But I'll just state some values in this space, or at least some things that I think we need to solve for. And then once we have detailed proposals, I think it'll be a little easier to flesh it out. But part of my concern in housing in general has been just the inability of I think developers and builders to build a manufactured or modular housing product to scale and know with a degree of certainty that that's a product they can bring to market inside of a jurisdiction and actually have a buyer ready to go for that. And so I'll use Summit County as an example. Summit County has stock approved plans, pre-approved plans for ADUs, for example. Now, what does that do for the market? It means that I, as a builder, within a degree of certainty, can know that I can build this product to scale, and provided there's not any variances or unforeseen circumstances, that will be a product that I can sell in Summit County. Obviously, there's some parameters around that, administrative review, et cetera. What we lack right now in our manufactured and modular housing industry is, quite frankly, any certainty that anything could be built to scale and placed in a community without some really intensive steps in the development review process that might preclude that from ever coming to fruition in the first place. I think it's really important that we are able to build certainly smaller footprint homes and certainly ADUs, but there is, I think, a market for housing that is built off site and then put on site where it makes sense, obviously, at a cost that is lower to everybody. If all you're talking about in terms of putting a modular manufactured home on a site is a soils engineer sample and an appropriate foundation and then the framing and structure of that home that fits those two things, it becomes an incredibly valuable opportunity to lower the cost of that housing for folks and be able to then offer our market friends. And I'm not typically a supply side solution guy, but I'll say that here, it very much plays into the consideration of being able to say, we've given a degree of confidence that you can build in Colorado and we can sell your product to homeowners in our communities. And so I would like to think through what would it look like to incentivize local jurisdictions to have some sort of stock building plan in place for smaller footprint homes. What would it look like to go through an administrative review process for those homes as opposed to a full-on variance every time you want to put one of those products into your home or into your lot? And then what does it look like for our builders? What do they need in terms of being able to do that to scale in our state? Fading West is a good example. There's another couple companies that are building homes out of really intriguing designs and materials. But until we provide some market for that in our state, it becomes very difficult to understand that to be an affordable price point for folks. So more on that, but I will just say that I think part of the conversation has to be what do we do to build more offsite at a lower price point for the consumer?
Right. So would that be a home that you're thinking, so in a residential neighborhood, if somebody bought a lot, I don't know what the zoning and rules and regs are right now, but could they bring that home, or can they already bring that type of a manufactured home into a community where all the homes are being stick built? I mean, do they allow a modular home to come into a community? Or I think of, is it Sunflower Village in Fort Collins? That's all manufactured housing in a park. So they're all the same type of homes.
I suspect, and I have to dig more into what it looks like across jurisdictions, but I suspect it's similar to what a lot of our housing policy is in the state, and it's a patchwork. And that patchwork really, I think, degrades confidence in the market. And I think that's a place where we need to look at where does it make sense to reasonably standardize some sort of process to where you could build a home offsite and bring it in a couple parts. There's a neighborhood, my understanding, here in Fort Collins, just south of me near Horsetooth, where most of those homes were actually built off site nearby and brought in by semi and placed on their foundations. We don't build like that anymore. And there's a reason for that, right? And I think, my first home actually as a child was a ranch that you would have never known was a modular home built off site. I mean, it looked like any other ranch in Fort Collins. This was in Michigan. My parents didn't know until they were the second owners of the home. They didn't know until years later that it was actually built and brought in on site in two pieces. I mean, I just think, and quality wise, structurally, there is no degraded efficiency or experience for the consumer inside of those things. It's just we haven't created a market environment where it's favorable to do that. And so I think it's really important we look at all the options we can. So this will be a bill with myself and Senator Bridges over in the Senate, really just looking to bring that manufactured modular housing industry, what I would hope to be up to the finish line of bringing more product to market in our state.
Great. Mindy.
Yeah, I applaud you. As Kathy and others know, we've been trying to push for modular housing factories in Jefferson County, and it has not worked out yet, but we're still hopeful. You mentioned just hearing from one of the governor's groups. I wonder, tying in the new some of the things going on in Colorado with the quantum computing hub, the Glow Park, the Global Energy in Golden, trying to bring in the universities and other private public partnerships to really make this, not only to push for more uniform standards, but also locations where this can be done very quickly and fill a need that we know is going to be there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because the cost of, and this is why you don't truck in a home from out of state, right? I mean, the cost of transit for a modular home is incredible. And so it becomes very important to be strategic about where we can really pop up or at least incentivize the ability to build these homes offsite. Yeah.
Kathy.
Yeah, following up on Mindy, this is really exciting. Two things. Apparently, this next round or next year, CHAFA is not going to be funding the modular housing portion. They've decided not to give out new grants. Is that correct? I don't know whether I heard that correctly or not. And that concerns me because I think we're kind of on a roll, and to stop the roll, I think would be premature. I think they want to see how it's going, but it would be nice to not put a full stop. I don't know. I was concerned when I heard that, and I wasn't sure whether I heard it correctly.
I'll check on that. Yeah.
The other thing is that I'm for tiny homes and modular housing. I live in Golden, and we have a form-based code. And I'm asked for things like, well, give me an example of a city with a form-based code that has what you're talking about. Show me what their code looks like. And it's just like, to make this easier, and I think it would be great to have the local jurisdictions do this, but can we give some examples from places of what the actual ordinances look like or the zoning language looks like for some of these things?
I think it's important. I did flag for the GOVs team that I feel like technical assistance from the state is going to be really important on this policy, because I think there's, absent a statewide building code, it becomes very difficult for local jurisdictions to sort of, I don't want to say make it up as you go along, but really be left to your own devices in terms of how to find a way to appropriately implement a bunch of other policies. So appreciate that very much. Yeah. And I'll check on the chat with these Kathy.
Yeah, and it's same thing for the tiny home legislation a couple of years ago. Same thing. I think a lot of the local jurisdictions just are staying away from it because they don't have the bandwidth to put the effort into figuring out all the nuts and bolts. And if somebody else figured it out for them, it might go better.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I think, and we ran into, I think similar challenges even with single stair last year. It's really hard to say you local jurisdictions shall do X by X date when all of a sudden you're basically going to have to make this up on your own, right? Or quite frankly, if you don't write the bill the correct way, you create a loophole where a local government can comply in letter, but certainly not in spirit. And I think it's important to really have those conversations in a way that are meaningful and to provide technical assistance and guidance from the state wherever possible. Yeah, the GOVs team did flag for me that they're very much interested in and looking through like where they should put some placeholders in their budget for things like that. So I think it's recognized as well. And Trish, not to belabor the conversation around this, but I would say another area of interest of mine, but it's going to require some action from our federal partners. And this trends more into the mobile home park space. HUD several years ago in their duty, and Fannie and Freddie in their duty to serve document, outlined what could have been a pilot program for creating a secondary market for mobile home loans on mobile homes. These are typically referred to as chattel loans. They're high interest rate loans. That is a rapidly depreciating product. So you as the consumer, should you buy a mobile home, a lot of times what you're faced with is a situation where you're upside down pretty quickly because the interest rate on your loan is pretty high. I mean, it can be similar to purchasing an aircraft or a boat. It's sort of unsecured personal property as opposed to, you know, the traditional mortgage I have on my home. And what we would really like to see is a world where CHAFA could potentially pilot a program to purchase some of these high interest rate loans and buy down what could be an otherwise very costly proposition for the consumer. I think when you do that, what you ultimately do, I sort of view it as a win-win proposition, because you create more space at the end of the day for you know, our traditional lenders in this space to do more lending. And you also create a more affordable housing product for folks who are perhaps on that cusp of affordability in our state. I think, you know, when you couple long-term financial stability in terms of your loan on your home, you're also more likely to actually purchase a new home, because you might know that you can actually afford that product in a way that is really unattainable at present. But it's going to require some investment and some guidance from our federal government. CHAFA cannot do it on at this point. We've worked with them on this piece, and so that will really require HUD coming to the table with some funding and willingness to make things happen on a local level and a statewide level. I would suggest that Colorado, because of our existing opportunity to purchase laws and the amount of work we've done to really transition ownership of mobile home park communities to the actual residents, we would be a perfect place for a pilot program like this, specifically among a resident-owned community, where you could say, great, we've taken the first step. You own, or a co-op owns the land underneath your home. The second step is we're able to actually buy down the mortgage and offer you a product at a lower interest rate, provided you do X, Y, and Z. It's going to require some engagement from our federal partners, and that is a difficult proposition inside of this Congress, but I wouldn't say that it's unique to this Congress.
Okay. All right. Well, does anyone else have any parting questions for Representative Boesenecker?
I've got one on manufactured home communities. There was a task force created last session to look at property taxation. Can you give us an update on how that's going and if there can be some actual legislation following that?
I don't have an update on where they're at in their process, Kathy. I'd have to check on that, but I'm hopeful that they'll make some recommendations. Yeah. And Trish, if you'll indulge me, I just have one other bill that I can talk about in 2 minutes.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. And so I'm also bringing a bill. It's the policy bucket is called GIGB, which is an acronym that stands for Yes in God's Backyard. Basically what this policy would do, it would open up for congregations, public schools and public universities that wish to utilize a portion of their land for housing. It would only subject that proposal to an administrative review process similar to those that were outlined in 1313 from last year, the Transit Oriented Communities bill, and also the ADU bill. It would allow density by right in those proposals. Parkside Hill here in Fort Collins is a great example of a project that is going well in spite of not insurmountable, but nearly insurmountable challenges from a lot of surrounding interests. And it looks to just simply say that this is a way we can connect the mission of a congregation with a need in the community. You know, as a former pastor myself, a lot of our congregations are really wondering whether to be there for 15 years. The fiscal viability of religious institutions in the United States is a huge concern, I think. And at the end of the day, what we could see happening here is a situation where a congregation maybe bought land because they intended to expand their sanctuary or whatever it might be. They're not in that same position anymore. And perhaps a way to maintain the long-term viability of that congregation while also meeting the need in the community is to look at a partnership that would offer up a portion of their property for affordable housing. And so this bill will be one of my first 5 bills. It is a priority, I think, for the governor's office as well. And we've, I think, really got some good folks thinking around this policy to think about how can we meet that density need inside of communities in another way. You know, think about it this way: if a congregation sat inside of a transit-oriented community, there's another opportunity for a municipality to meet some of those density targets by offering up another place where density could actually happen, should the parties agree. So it's a bill I'm super excited about. I think it makes sense. You've seen California pass a similar bill. I'll never say that on the mic after today, but it's really, I think, an intriguing proposal in terms of how we look at connecting mission to meeting our communities.
Yes, great. Julie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm smiling here a little bit because I remember that planning and zoning hearing on that development. Oh, there were a lot of NIMBYs on that one.
People have feelings.
Yeah, it was tough, but it's great. And they're gonna have a daycare center there too, which I think is really super important in that area. So, but you know, the mobile home parks, so I'm a strong advocate of supporting mobile home parks. And, you know, there's a lot there. It's certainly rental rates and those things, but maintenance is a huge issue in those parks. So, you know, your head starts to spin. Trish recalls, we did a case study of the citizen buyout of Park Lane Mobile Home Park in Fort Collins, Nueva Vida. And I think the lesson I learned in that, part of it was money, which they were able to cobble together very successfully. Of course, some of that was COVID funds, but part of it was leadership. And in that particular park, there really wasn't anyone capable of leading a homes association that would make decisions about repairs and investments and expenditures. And fortunately, they had a nonprofit come to the table to provide that support. So I just offer that because I think one is the buyout, the other is running it. And I think both have to be there for that to be successful.
It's a huge challenge. I mean, you know, I always tell people, you know, when you think about what we're trying to do with these laws and the opportunity to purchase, go back to your neighborhood tonight. And now think about a scenario where I say, in 120 days, I want you to organize all of your neighbors and raise the capital necessary to buy your neighborhood. I mean, my God, like the folks that have been able to do this, hats off to them. And because the funding is a challenge in and of itself, we were able to put $35 million behind a revolving loan fund, which is a drop in the bucket when you look at what parks are selling for in our state. But then the organizing piece and then the long-term sustainability of that community through leadership in the community is a real challenge. And I think, you know, it's how we crack that nut, I think, is TBD. I will say that some of the dollars that we've committed as a state can go actually towards organizing a park in advance. And I've been telling folks, you know, even if your park isn't for sale, you might want to think about if there's a way to get organized as a community well in advance, because it'll serve you well. But, you know, in Nueva Vida and other parks, there's other challenges that really would preclude folks from being able to do that. And
yeah,
that's why I really appreciate the nonprofits stepping in. And it's another great model for how we can be successful here, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But it took a lot of work. A lot.
Yeah. Some special people were behind it for sure.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else? Well, we thank you for all you're doing in this arena, Representative Boesenecker, and wish you luck in 2025. And we really appreciate you taking the time tonight to spend with us and share your thoughts. Really do appreciate it.
No, thank you all for the good conversation, the great questions. And I would just say, let's stay in touch about this policy because it impacts all of us in unique ways in our communities, and really just value the feedback and insights from this group.
Yes, will do.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, okay, team, before we drop off, our next meeting, oops, I'm going to stop this recording. Stop.